Ahoy and welcome back to the Blizzard podcast on all things RRS Discovery.
Woo!
My name's Julie. I work in the marketing team at Dundee Heritage Trust. I'm joined by my lovely colleague Kim, who's our learning curator.
Ahoy!
And we are also joined by Emma, who used to be a member of our ship's crew and has actually just come back from the Antarctic herself.
Ahoy! Is this how we greet our podcast listeners?
We do, yes.
Yeah.
It has to say nautical.
Yeah, so I'm Emma. I was on the ship's crew here first as a volunteer and then as a part-time ship's crew member for 2 years after I got obsessed with the story of the Discovery and polar exploration in general, and just couldn't get enough of it. And I've been trying to go to Antarctica for several years now, and I finally went this past January, so the austral summer, on a month-long voyage from New Zealand down to the Ross Sea and back.
So cool. So I guess like the burning question we all had when we found out was what method, how did you get down there? Because there's so many different paths, but what was your way in?
Yeah, I've tried a few different things. I've applied to, the U.S. has an artists and writers program. I've applied to that, thousands of applicants, maybe 2 to 4 people get it. No dice there. I've applied to be a curatorial assistant on South Georgia, made it to the interview, but didn't quite succeed. Applied to be a lab assistant, even though I don't have enough lab experience with various programs. And then finally, I found out that this tourist company, Heritage Expeditions out of New Zealand, has a scholarship called the True Young Explorer Scholarship for people 18 to 30, where you pay a tiny fraction of the price that anyone else would, and you have to share your journey when you get back, but you do get to go. And specifically to the Ross Sea, which is where the Discovery went, where the historical huts are. It's the place that I really, really wanted to go, but 99% of Antarctic tourism goes via South America, and then you're on the opposite end of the continent from where the Discovery guys went.
It's a pretty big continent too. You can't just nip it over.
Yeah.
You'd have to do a Shackleton.
Yeah.
You've pretty much been where Discovery was, and with having been on the ship's crew here in Dundee as well, we thought we could do a nice little compare and contrast and just discuss that kind of historical element versus the modern day. But it might be useful to start with what sparked your polar fascination, because you're big on all things polar. You've written things online, you know a lot about your polar stuff.
I've been to the archives, I've read the diaries. Some of them have mysterious orange stains on them that I assume are hoosh splatters. I've really gotten into the weeds. No, but the real question is, I don't know how I didn't find polar history earlier in my life. I feel like I must have had a comedic sequence of just barely missing it so many times, because I didn't even know who Scott was the first time I came to the Discovery Museum. So if you can't tell from my accent, I grew up in the US, but I was living in Scotland doing my PhD in St. Andrews. And I had a friend come visit and was looking for things to do with her. And I was like, there's a boat museum in Dundee. Boats are cool. Let's go check out the boat museum. I had no idea what it was about. And, it's a ship, not a boat. I can hear
I was going to say, you would have learned that. So
yeah. But boats are cool. Let's go check it out. And we went through that day, and the detail that really jumped out at me was the fact that the ship itself was iced in Antarctica for multiple polar winters, and they had a newspaper, and they had plays that they put on, and they had to sort of keep up morale and distract themselves, and this sort of creativity in this tiny isolated world that just really got me thinking, got me wondering, got me going, okay, I need to come back to this museum without my friend, who's lovely, but was kind of zooming through the exhibit, and I wanted to read everything. But the ticket's good for a year, so I was like, I will be back on my own, and I will read everything. And I just started doing exactly that, reading all the books, getting interested, and then I decided to apply to be a volunteer. And so started volunteering here, eventually turned into a part-time job, doing ship's crew stuff, so the sort of manual labor stuff, but it ended up being people facing as well, because the guests will see us polishing brass or caulking the deck or something in the last questions, and then it's a good vehicle for me to just spout the polar knowledge.
Yeah, so you joined our team as a volunteer and then got a paid part-time role off the back of that. and we believe you are our second only ship's crew, female ship's crew.
Yeah.
Which is quite the title to hold. And I think what we saw was just how passionate and knowledgeable you were, and how much of a great ambassador you were outside of the charity as well. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what it was like working within the teams that you did, and then also those experiences that you got to go outside and like speak on behalf of the charity to people.
Yeah. Well, doing deckhand work was not anything that I had any experience with. When I started volunteering, they said, we'll train you in everything that you need to know. And that was the case. I learned how to operate power tools. Actually, I had my parents saying, oh, wow, we should have had you do more around the house. And I'm like, well, I'm motivated because I like the ship and its history. Not so much because the power tools are the draw, but they are pretty cool as well. Yeah, I had one of those moments where you look at your life and you're like, how did you end up here? The day that we brought in a crane to remove the rudder from the stern, to take some weight off the stern for the urgent works. So I was standing there in a hard hat, assisting a bunch of Scottish men with a crane operation, which is never something I thought I'd do in my life. And if you told them me of 5 years previous that that's where I'd be 5 years in the future, she would have been like, how? Where? What? What's the discovery? But yeah, I think I learned a lot of skills. I've gotten a lot better at chatting with, like, if a plumber comes into my flat to fix it, like I sort of know what they're on about a little bit more. It's good life skills. And yeah, I have gotten the chance to do a lot of tour guiding on the ship, and chatting with the public, and chatting at, Dundee is a lot of polar history. So we will have events surrounding famous anniversaries or author talks, and getting to introduce people or chat a little bit about the history of the ship and these audiences is really fun too, because I'm one of those weirdos that enjoys public speaking.
Little weirdo. Enjoying public speaking, it's good.
It's just a way to share your passion.
It is exactly that.
And so what was it like being on ship's crew of the RRS Discovery? Like, that's being connected to the ship in a completely different way than even the job that Kim and I do. It's just, you're there with it all the time and you get to know it so well.
Adding to its history.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's breathing in the sawdust. It's no, we wear PPE. It's but it is physically being part of it. It's fascinating because Dundee, the ship is sitting in a very modern section of Dundee. You've got this very modern building right next door, the V&A. You're right by the road. There's cars going by. When there's a historical artifact that's with those sort of surroundings, I almost imagine like a time lapse of everything that the ship has seen. Like if there were the ghosts of the people from the first expedition or from Banzar just walking around on the deck, what would they think of these new surroundings, and just everything that the ship has seen and gone through, and sort of becoming part of that story yourself, going, oh, did Tom Crean polish this ankle basher? But maybe. It's really cool to have that physical connection of like the blood, sweat, and tears of it all, and realizing how much work goes into it, and being able to, when I go to archives, read the diaries, read the books, having that, knowing what the activities are like myself, like caulking. It's a really big one. The way that I think the contractors we brought in have figured out a faster process, but when we first started doing that, it would take two people like an hour to do a meter, several hours to do a meter of just one scene. And when you consider how thin the planks are and how many of them there are, it's miles and miles of caulking just to cover the deck. So it just gives you an appreciation for how much work goes into everything, and being able to remember that that's a museum object. Like the ship is the biggest object in the collection, which I'm sure you guys are saying all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's really fascinating that you were talking about, like, did Tom Crean polish his ankle basher, and then you were talking about, you were looking at the rudder being lifted. Of course, the men back in 1904, they also would have seen the rudder being lifted, but you couldn't get two more contrasting kind of situations for it being lifted and ways of it being lifted and all this kind of stuff. So were there any crew members, when you were doing research, when you were just spending time on the ship, were there any crew members from the original expedition or Banzar that you felt more connected to, or that you could kind of you could almost feel them channeling, because I mean we've had Aidan Dooley on the previous series of the podcast, and he said that when he comes onto the ship he almost can feel Tom Crean around him.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything like that for you?
Yeah, well, I've gotten strangely interested in Arthur Courtley.
I love Arthur so much. I was reading your blog with such fascination.
Yeah, that post was gonna be like a 500-word blurb, and then it became 9,000 words. But it's because I mean, the first thing that jumped out is he's American. I was like, what is he doing in the Royal Navy? Why is he? You know, he's on the lower decks as well. Like,
Yeah, so for anybody that doesn't know, who was Arthur Courtland?
yeah, he was a leading stoker. He was born in New York and lived in Baltimore, and he's from this. His father was originally from England, but the family moved to the U.S. and he was raised in America. And at some point in his 20s, he moved over to England, joined the Royal Navy, and found his way onto the same ship as Scott. And when Scott was looking for volunteers for the Discovery expedition, he put his name forward, and Scott chose him. So he ended up on the ship. He also was a frequent contributor to the South Polar Times. He did poetry, and he did drawings, which are kind of in an engravery style, which makes sense because his father was a painter and had an engraving business. So it almost kind of looks like it's etched, the drawings. Like they look a little bit like horror illustrations to me, actually, but it's just in a really cool way. So I don't know. I think about Arthur Courtley a lot. He also got really attached to the cat, Blackwall. Apparently the cat slept in his hammock with him. Yeah. So because he was a little bit displaced, when I looked into his background, and he was born into a fairly wealthy family in America. So it's interesting that he ended up in one of the ratings in the British Navy as well. He seemed a little bit like the wanderer of his family. So I do think a lot about him when I'm working on the ship.
I think the thing that pulled out to me from your blogs was the way that everyone else spoke about him as being like a really fine specimen of a man. Like so many of them were talking about his physical, but also that he was kind alongside it. Mm-hmm. He's also tall and ginger, which is just like my husband. So I think I definitely have a soft spot for him.
He was easy on the eyes. You can tell he's very fit even underneath quite a thick wool jumper. Yeah.
Speaking of like feeling connections and making connections, you got to go to Antarctica where the Discovery went.
Mm-hmm. The expedition I was on was called In the Wake of Scott and Shackleton.
So perfect.
Yeah, it was like the history expedition.
So some of the mutual places that you went to, I wonder if you could like highlight a couple of them that really stood out to you.
Yeah. So first I did the long journey to New Zealand, and that was obviously by 3 different planes rather than sailing the Discovery all the way around South Africa and everything. But I ended up in the very southern part of the South Island of New Zealand, and we went all the way south to the port of Bluff where we met the ship. And from there, we ended up tracing our way past some subantarctic islands, some of which are very storied in Antarctic history, like Macquarie Island, which Mawson had a fair amount to do with. Cherry Garrard had a fair amount to do with, because there was this whole campaign to stop this industry where they were boiling penguins for their oil, just like really nasty stuff. We stopped there. That was technically Australia, so I've now technically been to Australia. The world's weirdest claim to having been to Australia. We had to get an ETA for it. Then we worked our way south, and unlike Scott and the Discovery in 1901, we had satellite imagery of where the ice was.
That's helpful.
Yes. So every day we would have a little weather briefing from our expedition director. We'd see all the ice maps and weather maps and wind maps and everything, and we ended up having to work our way around a big section of pack ice. We still went through a little bit of it because they wanted to show us the ice. It is very cool to look at. The day we spotted our first iceberg, everyone was freaking out on deck, taking pictures with it, and then a few days later it's like, oh, they're everywhere. But the first place that we landed was Cape Adare, which is also the first place in Antarctica that the Discovery landed. And a few years before, it had been the site of the Southern Cross expedition, which was the first to overwinter on the Antarctic continent, like on the land. And Louis Bernacchi, who was the physicist on Discovery, was on Southern Cross, as was the captain of the relief ship, the Morning. He was also on Southern Cross. And Cape Adare was fascinating. Reading the Discovery men's diaries of their time at Cape Adare, they found the hut from Southern Cross, which had just been abandoned 2 or 3 years ago. They found, apparently, Borchgrevink, who was in charge of that expedition, who was Norwegian-British. He had brought a comedic quantity of Union Jacks. So they were all commenting on how there were just piles of Union Jacks everywhere. And they did make a trip up to the grave of Hansson, who was this Norwegian biologist who was on the expedition, who sadly died during the Southern Cross expedition. So they all went up and paid their respects to Bernacchi's former colleague. It was a bit of a probably complicated experience for Bernacchi because the British establishment of polar expeditions really didn't like Borchgrevink. So there's a lot of trash talking of his expedition. Which Bernacchi had been on. And when I was on my ship, which was called the Heritage Adventurer, by the way, I bought Bernacchi's Southern Cross diary in the gift shop on board, and I was reading it as we were going. I just really realizing what a young man he was, because he was like 23 at this point. And he had a lot of issues with Borchgrevink as well. Borchgrevink seems to have been a bit of a fabulist. Bernacchi would say things like Borchgrevink will claim to have all this knowledge about these scientific instruments, but then Bernacchi will see him using them and he has no idea how to use them. So it got to the point where in his diary he wouldn't say Borchgrevink's name anymore. He just wrote the individual.
Oh, wow.
You could just hear all you need to know.
Yeah. The individual. So it's not a very happy time they had at Cape Adare, and seeing it in person really made me understand the sort of extenuating circumstances, because you can't get anywhere from Cape Adare. It's this really like sharp northern peninsula jutting up. It's like sort of like the spine of a sea monster. You can't really climb up the cliffs on either side. There's just this one little flat area of beach, triangular beach, sort of in the lee of the peninsula, and that's where they put the hut. But I was like, what were they thinking? There's like this little beach they can walk around on. They're not going to be able to climb the ridge to then get to the continent from there. They're not going to go expeditioning on the sea ice in the winter because it's the winter. And then in the summer, they're trapped there. And it's an Adelie penguin colony. So there's hundreds of thousands of penguins there squawking 24/7. Running around. They are noisy and they are smelly. I was like, this is just really engineered to have a bad time. And they did not have a good time in that hut. They did what they could scientifically around there. They lost one of their members, and they made, the rest of them made it home. But I was just like, wow, really bad location planning. Yeah. Not that they had satellite imagery or anything.
Even if you all like really got on and liked each other, 6 months afterwards, you're gonna be ready to let go somewhere else.
There was this amazing quote in Bernacchi's diary that was something along the lines of, in the winter, he was like, oh, we all sleep until about 11 a.m. and then we're only up until about 5 p.m. and then we all go back into our bunks. And I wonder if, maybe we'll just sleep here forever. Maybe we won't wake up and maybe we will sleep for 100 years and then wake up then and then make our way back to civilization, which will have forgotten about us. And maybe in some archive somewhere we'll find some scant mention of an expedition that went south in 1898. But it was just one of those moments where you're reading the diary like, woof, shivers.
And then, as you say, for Bernacchi to go back to that place, really not that long after.
Yeah.
And to have been one of the only people that had ever been south on that expedition as well. So everybody's kind of looking to him anyway. And then,
I imagine he had a lot of complicated emotions swirling around at that trip. And he's there with a new bunch of newbies. But they're going much further south to places where they can actually go sledging from. When the ship picked up Southern Cross, at the end of that winter. They did end up going a little bit further south, and I think they pretty immediately saw way better landing sites. And I can just only imagine what they must have been thinking that entire time. So we kept going further south as well. We ended up stopping at this place called Inexpressible Island.
Just a name.
It's a wonderful place name. It's because on Scott's second expedition, the one that went terribly wrong, there was this often forgotten about group of people who they were dropped off there for a summer, and they were meant to be picked up by the ship. But the ship couldn't get to them. It tried multiple times to get to them, but the ice and everything blocked it. And so they ended up, 6 of them, led by Victor Campbell, had to overwinter there, and they survived by the skin of their teeth. The reason they lived and Scott's party didn't is just that they were near the shore, so they could access seals and stuff for food. But they had a miserable winter there, and afterwards they decided to call the place Inexpressible Island. I think so. We saw that place, and it was actually really hot that day. Not hot, but when it's a dry heat, there isn't moisture in the air trying to suck away your body heat. So if the sun's out and it's not windy, you can actually feel really warm. So I'm standing there sweating and thinking about this awful winter they experienced. The other thing about actually being there is that you do start to understand. Reading the books, I'm always like, why couldn't they just pick them up? The ship they say they tried multiple times. Why couldn't they get to them? It's still like, seeing it physically, it's still the case that on our big modern expedition ship, we couldn't know if we could land at a place until we could physically see the beach, if it was blocked with ice or not.
Right.
Yeah. So, I trusted them reading these books. It's like, they're all seasoned sailors. If they say they couldn't land, they couldn't land. But seeing it in person is a whole different thing.
Wow. And I think it sounds like having your background and your knowledge before you went on the trip has really expanded what you got out of the trip. Was that the kind of case for everybody that was on board, or was it a whole mixture of people that had different motives for being there, different levels of understanding of the Antarctic?
Yeah, for me, it was really like the books were coming to life. Reading all the books, even if there's a map included in the book, I still get really confused about, okay, where are we? What direction are we going? What are we looking at? Where is this in relation to that? So I was putting it all together. But yeah, I was expecting there to be more history buffs on board, but it was mostly people who are interested in wildlife. Even though, like I said, this was the history trip because we went all the way south to Ross Island and saw the huts, but most of the people on board were there for the wildlife. There were lots of bird watchers. I don't consider myself a bird watcher, but even I was really recognizing a lot of the species that were following the ship by the end. I was like, wow, okay. That is black-browed albatross, and that's an Antarctic petrel, and that's a sooty shearwater, and it was like, wow, where did this come from? There were some people on board who were on personal quests to see every species of penguin.
That's a fun quest.
Yeah. There's apparently like 18 species of penguin. And there are a few that only live in the Antarctic, like emperors and adelies. So the day that we saw emperors only from a distance, those folks like completed their quest. And I talked to one of them the next day, and he was having an existential crisis. He was like, what do I do with my life now?
I dedicated so much time to looking for penguins, and now they've seen them all.
Yeah, you pick a new quest. I don't know. I'm feeling a little bit like that too. It's like, wow, I've been trying to get to Antarctica for so many years, and now I've done it. So what's next?
Yeah, no, I can imagine.
Yeah, so it was a mixed bag. There was a historian on board. And so all our guides, the days at sea and the days when we weren't doing landings, we'd be getting all these lectures. It was a little bit like being at university. They would all be lecturing about their specialty areas, and the historian was taking us through all the expeditions, and he quickly realized that I was insane about them. So he was chatting with me a lot, but he had done, you guys will love this. He had dug into the play that they put on, A Ticket of Leave.
Yeah.
He found a script. He found like the script. It was never a well-known or popular play. He said it was really badly written. But he read the whole thing, condensed it, and he had the guides put it on for us on our way back north.
So cute.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so this was the play that was performed in the Terror Theatre?
Yeah, the Royal Terror Theatre in the Discovery Hut in Antarctica in the winter of 1902. This involved, so the gist of the play is our main characters are Australians who had done their time at the penal colony in Australia, and they'd gotten their ticket of leave to go back to England. So they go back to England, and this guy's returned home, and he's trying to be an honest man and make something of himself, but he runs into someone that he knows from the Australian penal colony who's trying to bring him back into a life of crime. But on Discovery, they wrote in a female character who didn't exist in the original play called Marianne, which was a term for a homosexual man at the time, I should mention. So this was played by Gilbert Scott, who was one of the Royal Marines. In drag, was playing Marianne.
Pictures are amazing.
It's beautiful. So the historian on the ship was like, well, I can't figure out anything about what Marianne's role was in the play. I mean, we all know she was just there to be a pretty lady for them all to look at on stage. So that's exactly what he did. He just sort of he had the condensed version of the play happening, and then at one point Marianne comes out, and he told all of us in the audience that we were playing the roles of the Discovery crew, and these were our crewmates up there, and we needed to heckle them. So people were like, it was Howard, our medic, was being Marianne, and people were wolf whistling and hooting and hollering, and Howard like sashayed up to the stage. He had this great wig on with braids, and he took a napkin out and he kissed it with his red lipstick, and then he handed it to a lucky audience member, and that was all we saw of Marianne. But they recreated the photo at the end. They had all our cast members taking the same poses as the photo of the Discovery ship's crew doing it. It was incredible. That just made my historian heart very happy.
That's so fab, because you get people putting on the entertainment to keep everyone's morale up. That's exactly the same.
Yeah.
Whereas your bird watchers are there to appreciate the wildlife, and I'm sure Edward Wilson appreciated them, but that's also your dinner on the Discovery. Like, some things have changed so dramatically.
Yes.
And then other things stay so much the same, and that's just really incredible, I think.
Yes, we did not eat penguin.
Yeah, good clarification here. No seal, no skua.
No, none of that. You do get dive bombed by the skuas, though. That is real. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
They their nests are not very well marked. So you'll just be walking around. You'll get too close to a skua nest. The skuas are like seagulls, but worse. And if you start getting dive bombed by them, you know you're too close to the nest. So you're supposed to hold your hand above your head and back away the direction that you came until they stop attacking you.
Wow.
This
Is very handy to know.
Yeah.
happened to most of us at least once.
We could try that.
And I know the seagulls are quite aggressive here in Dundee
Yeah.
and in St. Andrews as well. So I was like, oh no.
I imagine that going to the huts, the expedition huts, must have been a complete, because they're a bit of a time capsule in the way that they've been preserved. So can you describe what that experience was like?
Yeah. I should say first off, I didn't actually make it to the Discovery hut itself. Our ship was going in January, and the Ross Sea, it's the southernmost navigable sea. Like, it's the southernmost you can get via ship. We got to 77 degrees south. Incidentally, the name of the new cafe here at Discovery Point, because that's where Ross Island is, McMurdo, all this. But in January, the sea ice is still going away. So you'd have a better chance of getting to the huts on the February voyage, which this company does too, a January voyage and February voyage. So we got within a couple of miles of seeing the Discovery hut. So we stared longingly in the direction of McMurdo over the sea ice, a little bit like the Morning probably did that first winter summer when they tried to rescue Discovery and they couldn't quite break Discovery out when it was frozen. But we didn't actually get to the Discovery hut. So we made it to the Terra Nova hut at Cape Evans and Shackleton's hut from the Nimrod expedition at Cape Royds, which are really close to each other. Like, this whole journey was a really great exercise in not knowing what we were doing the next day, because as I said, you had to physically see the landing site before we knew if we could land there. Mm-hmm. So sometimes we would get woken up in the middle of the night, like, oh, it's 4 a.m. and the conditions are perfect to land at blah, blah, blah. Everybody up. Zodiac's leaving at 4:30. The Zodiacs are the little motorboats we would take to shore. So the morning that we arrived at the huts, I kept I didn't quite know when the huts were going to come. So I was sort of anticipating. And then suddenly I thought I had so much time. And then suddenly it was time for the huts. And I was like, oh no, I have no more time to prepare. I quickly went and reread. Cherry Garrard has this lovely passage in Worst Journey where he describes standing at the door of the Cape Evans hut and what you can see in every direction. I was like, that's the thing to reread before this, I think. But yeah, so I woke up. And the intercom said, we're off the shore of Cape Royds right now. However, it's all iced up, so we're not going to be able to land here. Let's go on to Cape Evans and see how that looks. And then like 15 minutes later, the intercom comes on again. So, I go back to sleep. And the intercom comes on again. Cape Evans looks absolutely perfect. We're going to go after breakfast. Briefing at this time, and then blah, 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 we're going to go. So that's how quickly it can all happen and how close they are. They're something like 6 miles apart.
Here, the town only.
Yeah.
Saying we're going to go to Cape Evans.
Yeah, and the conditions are absolutely perfect. So the Cape Evans hut is really close to the water. It's actually so close that from a conservation perspective, they're considering moving it further up the beach at some point. So I see it. It's so close to shore. There's these tiny little waves just gently lapping against this black volcanic beach because it's right under Mount Erebus. You can see sort of Mount Erebus looming in the distance, and it's on this volcanic spit of land. And I was thinking it's just beautiful. It's like I feel like we got the one day that this place is the Riviera, compared to Cherry Garrard talking about how there's a lovely beach that we saw when we landed, and then we never saw it again because it was covered in snow. I saw the lovely beach. Bright sunny day. We kept getting so lucky with the weather. We would be somewhere, and then the next day our expedition leader would be like, oh, the lovely place we were yesterday, well, today there's 60 knot katabatic winds coming down off the plateau. I felt like someone was looking out for us weather-wise, or someone was doing weather magic in their cabin or something. But we got to go in the hut. We had to stand in a queue and clean our boots to make sure we weren't tracking anything in. We weren't allowed to touch anything, but we could wander around. It was a surprisingly nice, the Cape Evans hut. It was a nice space. Because I had seen it all in the 3D rendering online, it was more about physically being present. What are the other sensory experiences? The smell was a little bit like being on Discovery. It was different, but I feel like there's like a conservation-y smell of wood rot and must and damp a little bit. But there's sort of a preservative smell, and there's a big pile of seal blubber in the corner. So there was kind of a fishy, blubbery smell that was not quite as pleasant.
Which luckily we don't have one.
Yeah. Petition for that not to go in.
Yeah. It's the kind of smell that is objectively not nice, but I wanted to bottle it up and take it away with me. People say that comparing the Cape Royds hut and the Cape Evans hut it's like an extrovert's hut and an introvert's hut, which matches Scott and Shackleton's personalities. Scott's Cape Evans hut is very much the introvert's hut. There's lots of little nooks and crannies. Everyone has a little bit of privacy where their bunks are. There's little walls dividing different sections, and I'm an introvert, so I kind of like that. I would want my own little corner. The Cape Royds hut it's a bit smaller, but everything's kind of centrally located in one big room, and you can see everyone from where you're at. And that would, if I was an extrovert, sure, but I'm an introvert. I got a bit of a taste of this on the ship itself because I shared a cabin with someone. And so it was really no downtime, no time on my own. We were living a little bit cheek by jowl, which they really must have been doing in that hut because there were 25 men that lived in that hut for the winter. And even though it was cozier and comfier than I expected, it would have been cramped. Looking at a lot of the old little conserved items is fascinating too. There's like jars of food that absolutely do not look like what they claim to be at this point. There's old-timey medicines with old-timey medicine ads, which is fun. It's just neat knowing whose bunk is whose. We got the chance to go around. Everyone was really chatty and excited to be in there. We took some pictures, and then we all went back onto the ship. And we ended up anchoring there for the night. And later that evening, there was an announcement that anybody who wanted to go back to the Cape Evans hut could go a second time. And I was sprinting to the sign up, of course, even before the announcement was over. And that second time we did it in silence. We decided we just wanted to wander through and nobody talk and just sort of take the space in. You can walk through the empty stables where all the ponies were. There's a few strange items scattered around the beach, including the remains of a dog. So you can see one of the dog's skeletons as well, sort of mummified remains of a dog. There's a fur. I also wandered off among the little volcanic hills, and because it was a windless day that day and I'd gotten away from everyone, it was just completely silent. That was probably the most magical thing I experienced. It makes me like, Ponting called his film The Great White Silence, partially because it's a silent film, but mostly because Antarctica can be very quiet. If there's no wind happening, it was just very strange being in a vast open landscape where there's nothing. There was no machinery hum. There's no animals. There's no motors going, no wind. Just for a few seconds, then a skua will cackle or something will break it, or I'll hear one of the other people. But I think the only thing I can compare it to is being deep in a cave, but that's closed, it's not open. So that was a really, really magical, special day. Seeing the hut from the perspective of a historian, it was fascinating because I think a lot of people talk about it like it is a time capsule, like nothing's changed and like they could just wander in. And I feel like I see it as, I understand why people see it that way, but I think I see it with more of a museum worker's hat on, where I'm curious about how conserving it has worked over time and how they've changed it. Because the Antarctic Heritage Trust are the people who look after, this is the New Zealand Antarctic Heritage Trust, separate from the British one, which looks after like Port Lockroy and stuff. I was curious as to how it had changed over the years. Like, other people used it after Scott. The often forgotten about half of the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition with the Endurance, the men on the Aurora used it. It got completely iced up and they took all the ice out, and then people from McMurdo would come over in the 50s and 60s, and Silas Wright got to go back as like an octogenarian and visit it when he was an old man. Be like, oh yeah, that's where I slept, and that's where I walked up to the hill and took the meteorological readings, and there was my ice cave, and blah blah blah. He was the physicist on Terra Nova. So I think it was more of seeing it from that perspective. Like, I could tell that they weren't going to come through the door because I could tell things had changed. Scott's bunk was fairly bare. There weren't all there's the famous photo of him sitting at his desk. And there's loads of pictures of his wife and his baby in the background, and loads of books on the shelf, and there just wasn't much there. So
I was just thinking, like, there's such iconic photos from those expeditions. And so as you were going around, could you almost see the framing of them almost as you were walking through?
Absolutely. There's that one photo of what the section of bunks they call the tenements. Which is like where Cherry was, where Bertie Bowers was, where Captain Oates was, and there's that strange plank of wood at a diagonal used to prop up one of the bunks, and that's still there. There's still a whole bunch of pony equipment like bridles and stuff underneath Oates's bunk. There's still Bertie Bowers' green hat on a shelf above his bunk. I can't believe no one's nicked that hat over the years. I went around and took pictures. I had people take pictures of me standing in the pictures. So you can see in that picture, Bertie is standing on a stool and writing on his bunk. And, you can, compared to me, you can tell how short he was. Because I'm standing in roughly the same spot without a stool.
I think it's remarkable that you can go to these places, and whether you're a polar buff or not, the impact that these expeditions had on our understanding of the planet, the climate, the Antarctic, the wildlife there. It's incredible that people can go to that and that they can, kind of see that played out in real life and almost have those same experiences and get a better appreciation for the work that was done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the people who knew nothing about it definitely were impacted by the place. Like, you could tell they felt something in there. And there was loads of wildlife already just around the hut. Just standing on the beach by the Cape Evans hut, I saw a jellyfish, which I wasn't expecting in the Ross Sea. I saw a whale blow. I saw a couple penguins come wobbling by. A seal came out. And you know that where seals are like doing the worm? That movement, apparently the scientific term is called galumphing.
Delightful.
Yeah. So a seal came galumphing out of the water, actually sort of, I think the seal just wanted to rest and then realized there were a lot of people on this beach. So then it went galumphing back in the water and I felt a little bad. I was like, sorry, buddy. But loads of wildlife, and that must have been what they were seeing all the time.
How do we balance the ecological side of tourism in the Antarctic with that need for people to be there to understand the space, but also how do we leave as little trace as possible, with the Antarctic being such an extreme example of climate change?
Yeah. It's a place that people often talk about like it's another planet entirely, but it's on our planet. It's connected to us. Things that we do affect it. They have, captured traces of pollutants in Antarctica that have made their way by wind and sea from the inhabited parts of the world all the way down there. So we very much affect it. I really feel guilty about going as a tourist, honestly. I thought about it a lot before, do I really want to go as a tourist? I tried to go as someone who worked there. And it's largely the carbon emissions involved in getting to the place that I was feeling guilty about. I believe all the flights I did and everything equates to about one average British person's annual emissions. Just horrific. It's horrific. Which is why I was so questioning whether I should go as a tourist. And I don't think, personally, this was a once-in-a-lifetime trip for me. I would not go as a tourist again. If I had the chance to work there, I would go in a heartbeat. But it was the carbon emissions that were the issue. Because once you're actually on the ship, there are a lot of measures that we take for biosecurity and for protecting the animals that I found really fascinating, felt really comfortable with on the ship.
I was going to ask about what kind of things did they do on the ship too?
Yeah. There's stuff like, as we were going south, the days were getting longer and longer. We had night in New Zealand. We didn't when we got to Antarctica. My weather app said no sunset today.
Cool.
It usually says the sunset time. It said no sunset today. But when we were still in the realm of night, after every dinner, there would be an announcement. Everyone go back into your rooms and shut the curtains because we don't want to confuse any of the seabirds with the lights coming out from our ship.
Wow.
So we would do that every single night, especially since we had a lot of keen birders on board. We very much did not want the seabirds bumping into us. We also learned an awful lot in the subantarctic islands about pest species that live on some of these subantarctic islands. Like, they did not natively have rats and mice. Those came with sailing ships. And they're important nesting sites for seabirds, albatrosses and stuff, who are ground nesters and get just decimated by the rats and mice. So a lot of our guides had been involved in projects to get rid of these pests on places like Macquarie Island and Campbell Island. And we got to see the effects of, I think Macquarie is about 10 years post rats at this point, and Campbell's 20 years. And we were seeing the before pictures, and we obviously saw the after. And a lot of the wildlife is coming back, and a lot of the vegetation is coming back as well, which is incredible. Every single time we landed, before we landed at a new location, we had to go through a biosecurity check. So we had to bring all of our outerwear to the lounge, and one of the guides would go through our outerwear with us, looking at the Velcro to see if there were any seeds in there, if we were bringing any hitchhikers with us from one biome to another. And they had a bunch of vacuums there to like clean out the pockets and everything. And we did this before every land day at a new location. Once we passed biosecurity, we could go put our stuff in our cubbies in the mudroom to then go out into the Zodiac. We would go on shore, do our thing, and then when we got back on board, they gave us these gum boots for stepping out because we had to get into the water, and we would have to clean the gum boots. We had this big boot brush machine, and then we had to step in antiseptic, and this was a lot to do with bird flu, which is spreading around the world and is a big concern. It has not been detected in the Ross Sea, I believe, but we don't want to be the ones that bring it there because it's really easy to spread it. One of the other scholarship people on board is a veterinarian, so she knew a lot about it, and was reminding us of our biosecurity a lot. We also were not allowed to, the only parts of us that were meant to be touching the ground were the soles of our boots. We weren't allowed to kneel, squat, lay down, sit down. We couldn't even set our backpacks down. Occasionally you might have to. Like I brought a dry bag with me and I had to set that down once or twice. And then I dipped that in the antiseptic as well when I got back on board. Because we were going through, when you're going through a penguin colony, there's guano. There's, if they're molting, there's little bits of feathers just kind of flying in the air. I was describing it as we're walking through a lot of biology. Yep. There's this great stuff called ornithogenic soil, bird-derived soil. That is to say, soil that comes from birds' guano and the remains of dead birds. So their colonies are literally on remains of dead birds. That's the thing they don't tell you about penguin colonies. So that was the biosecurity, and I thought that was really cool. New Zealand, and just in general, does that a lot because they have a lot of endemic species in New Zealand, and you have to go through biosecurity when you're at the airport there. If any listeners have ever flown to New Zealand, they might inspect your hiking boots, and if they're too muddy, you have to clean them, especially if you've been to a farm recently. And as for interacting with the wildlife, which was the other big part of this, we are required to maintain a 5-meter distance from the wildlife at all times. We can't block off their access to the sea. We can't surround them. We can't block their access to their chicks. Every landing site, we would get a briefing with where we could and couldn't go, because there are some areas that are called ASPAs, Antarctic Specially Protected Areas, under the Antarctic Treaty. So there are some cases where we were allowed on a beach, but not up into a penguin colony, but we could just look at it. So we were very, very clear on those instructions, and I think everyone was very keen to follow the rules. Now, the 5-meter thing, the penguins don't know it. Yeah. The people know you're supposed to say 5 meters to the penguins, but the penguins aren't aware of that.
And the guys in their diaries write about how curious and intrigued they are.
They're so curious, and they have no predators on land. I mean, the skuas will go for the chicks, but if you're a full-grown penguin, you have no predators on land. So they'll come right up to you. So you do have to keep an eye out and make sure they're not getting too close to you. Just sort of back away if they're approaching you. Again, making sure you're not getting in their way. There are certain paths they use which get called penguin highways, which is adorable. So if we noticed a penguin highway and we were trying to cross the penguin highway, we had to wait. It's just like crossing the street. We had to wait until there's no cars, no penguins coming, and then you can cross the penguin highway.
And then just opposing that with like Wilson and the boys just deciding to take one back to the Discovery. Like how vastly different that consideration is.
It was the wild, wild west. Yeah. They were killing them to eat, but also for science. It's this fascinating. I think about that a lot with nowadays we hear about that and we're shocked. We're like, how could any animal lover do that? But like Wilson very much considered himself an animal lover.
Yeah.
And to an extent, that's just the tools they had available for science. Taxidermy was the way that we learn about these species and spread this knowledge. It's just we're able to do that much less invasively now. So back in the day, those two things could be true. I do taxidermy and I'm an animal lover. Yeah. It's very different today. The Antarctic Treaty and especially the Environmental Protocol are huge, and we had a lot. I was quite comfortable with a lot of the rules and regulations regarding interacting with the wildlife. It's just very cute to wait for a penguin to go as well.
Absolutely.
It's so adorable. I can almost imagine them building up to you like, thank you.
Yeah, after you. The Adelies, they're so little. They're the perfect. I wanted to pick them up so bad. They're the perfect size. Obviously I didn't, but I really, even though they do smell really bad. I wanted to pick them up, but so they're tiny. But they really, I don't know if they really stomp, but you could really hear their little footsteps on the rocks. And so sometimes like you couldn't just tell just from hearing whether it was a person or a penguin coming up behind you.
And they're so small.
You turn around and like, oh, it's yay high.
They've got heavy feet.
Yeah.
You mentioned about not wanting to go back as a tourist again necessarily.
It's my personal feelings on the matter, yes.
But what's next for you?
Yeah, in my I have a job life. I'm an academic, As I said, the reason I was in Scotland in the first place was doing a PhD, and I'm now a postdoc. I have sadly moved away from my darling Discovery. I'm glad to be back here to visit with you guys just now. But I live in England these days. I work at the Open University in Milton Keynes with the astrobiology group there. So for astrobiology, think people looking for microbes on Mars and stuff like that. It's really cool. It's sort of like you could definitely draw parallels between the early Antarctic explorers and people who are space explorers these days. So I am doing just that. I'm bringing Antarctica into my research. I do astrobiology ethics. So I'm a bit more interdisciplinary between the sciences and the humanities. There are a lot of ethical questions surrounding our activity in space, like should we mine asteroids? If we found microbes on Mars, what are our ethical duties towards that life? There's really not a playbook for this stuff. But I'm looking at examples from Antarctica regarding environmental ethics, a lot of which I saw in person with the ASPAs and the rules for surrounding interaction with wildlife. I'm looking at environmental ethics in Antarctica and how we can use that as an analog for astrobiology, because we just have a lot more data, concrete, practical examples and experience from Antarctica. For example, you guys know like Lake Vostok, like subglacial lakes in Antarctica? Like there's these lakes that are under kilometers of ice shelf ice cap in Antarctica that scientists have been drilling into to get samples. And these are lakes that have been isolated from the atmosphere for up to millions of years. So there's all this concern about how can we sample this to learn about it, but without contaminating it, without making it impossible to answer the science questions we're actually out here for in the first place. And I'm looking at how people came up with a code of conduct for doing those experiments, and what can we learn from that for if we were to go to an icy moon in the outer solar system that have these subsurface oceans like Europa and Enceladus, and how could we sample those, which to be clear is decades away technology-wise. But
very cool.
Yeah.
Because we talk a lot about the Antarctic Treaty, and obviously there's treaties in states as well, and like how one place that humans haven't got to and then another place that humans haven't got to, and how they sort of learn and that collaboration. And it's really great that that's happening again, that we can learn the lessons faster and implicate the good stuff and just let the stuff that didn't work go by the wayside.
Environmental ethics often happened ex post facto on Earth, that is after damage has occurred and we're trying to sort of rectify it, but we haven't done much in space yet, so there's a chance.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Sometimes feel like I'm shouting into the void, but we do what we must.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course.
Thank you to our listeners for joining us as well. That was just wonderful to hear, with such knowledge going there and just the experiences that you had.
It was a dream come true. I got back months ago now, and I'm still processing. I'll be processing it for years. It kind of feels like it happened in another life, but it didn't. It was real. I was there. Where the Discovery was.
It's just so cool.
And now I'm here where the Discovery is.
Anna, you can be too.
Yes. Please come visit the Discovery Museum. It is incredible. I'm not at all biased.
No, you can be too. Come and visit Discovery for yourself. Wander in the footsteps of Captain Scott and Ernest Shackleton. If you can't come and visit us, you can watch us on YouTube. Emma, in her previous life as a ship's crew member, has written a blog about being on the ship's crew team at Discovery, which is on our website. We've got this monthly podcast, The Blizzard, that you can catch up on. And in our previous episode, we were going over the soundscape of the ship restoration work. So if you want to hear what it sounded like when the rudder was lifted, you can hear that in the last episode of The Blizzard.
And we will see you next month.
See you then.
Bye.
Bye.